Integrated Drive Generator, IDG, provides electrical power for all the aircraft systems. You recognize the IDG system. The IDG, the external cooling circuit, and the IDG oil cooler. During operation, the oil is pumped out of the IDG to be cooled down in the cooler. Then the cooled oil comes back into the IDG.
That's next on Maximus.
So the entire aviation world, including yours truly, has been confused by this latest JeJu Airlines mystery crash. And that was long before we got the news that the cockpit voice and data recorders abruptly stopped working 4 minutes before the crash. So as a non-professionally trained aviation enthusiast, well, if you need to go somewhere in a Cessna 152, I can get you there, but that's about it. But regardless, still the smartest and brightest aviation minds in the world are scratching their collective heads over this rarely, if ever seen, total loss of electric power on a commercial airliner with at least one functioning engine, especially one that also failed to drop the landing gear or flaps, and apparently didn't have enough time to start the APU, yet still managed a near picture-perfect action movie-style heroic landing, only to be obliterated and evaporated by a freaking brick wall at the end of a runway on live TV. So I think I have a plausible theory and I'm going to lay it out for you. But I'm also seriously looking forward to reading the comments from you. So with that, here's my theory. So the huge mystery about this JeJu crash that nobody can yet understand is how, with one engine still running, even if the crew shut down the wrong engine, how, suddenly, without warning, just 4 minutes before touchdown, the entire aircraft's electrical system could completely shut down. And again, as I said, even experts can't recall this happening, at least in recent memory. So that got me thinking, what could possibly have caused this sudden and monumental electrical failure? And then that led me to ask the question, what if? What if it wasn't sudden, but a chain of events that took place at the moment of the bird strike? And it was that thought that came to me as I was researching a similar event that took place back in 2018 on a West Atlantic Airlines flight over Europe, also having to do with the number 2 CFM engine electrical generator on a Boeing 737. But first, let me take you through my process. And like I said, you can let me know if you think this is possible or even plausible. While we think of a bird versus a large passenger jet as just a small object hitting a powerful machine, you have to consider physics. For any given impact, the most important determinant of damage potential is the speed or energy of the impact. This is because the kinetic energy, which has to be absorbed by the airframe or the engine, is the product of mass and speed squared. So it's the speed of the aircraft rather than that of the bird, of course, that makes up nearly all of the closing speed during an impact. Thus, aircraft speeds are directly proportional to the damage potential for a collision with a particular object. It's also important to understand that the kinetic energy that is absorbed by an engine or an airframe during an impact is converted into an exponential force on that object based on the distance over which the impact is delivered. Of course, the variables of speed and distance can change depending on the situation. That said, the only additional assumption required to calculate impact force is that mass equals weight. Structural damage, therefore, is proportional to impact force rather than quantity of kinetic energy absorbed, and the forces can be quite large. A 6.8 kilogram or about a 15-pound goose impacting an aircraft at 200 knots can be assumed to exert a force of over 16 tons. The effect of proportionality from the square of the airspeed is illustrated by the fact that the same 6.8 kilogram bird hitting an aircraft at 250 knots can be assumed to exert an extra force of nearly 26 tons and an aircraft at 280 knots over 32 tons, and so on. So while these figures are approximations, their order of magnitude and their concentration over a very small area means there is no realistic way of hardening any engine or airframe to completely resist such a force. So certification standards tend to address the containment side effects of bird impacts rather than avoidance. So hold on to that thought for a minute and keep that figure in the back of your mind throughout the video. 32 tons of force from a 15-pound bird hitting a plane at anywhere from 200 to 500 miles per hour. That is always a potentially deadly situation. Okay, so I won't rehash all the particulars that we've gone over in the past few videos on the JeJu crash, but they're on the channel if you haven't seen them. However, we have established that the voice and data recorders were powered by the number 1 engine generator, the IDG or Integrated Drive Generator. And we also know if the number 1 engine failed, the number 2 engine with its generator was backup. And then if you lose both engines, you have the APU available to handle the emergency backup tasks. However, the evidence suggests the crew didn't have time to spool up the APU, but they didn't need it because the number 2 engine was running, so then why the power failure? And that's where the IDG, the Integrated Drive Generator, or just generator for short, comes into play. It's an AC generator used to power the entire aircraft with one on each engine and the APU. So basically, even though the number 2 engine was still operating, it wasn't generating any electricity. So essentially, they were landing without any power source at all. But why is the question that has baffled smart people and YouTube clowns alike. So going on the assumption that they didn't have time to reach for the gravity landing gear release cables, what would happen to a 737 without both engines and an APU? Well, according to Boeing, if a 737 simultaneously lost power from both engine generators on both engines as well as the APU, the aircraft would experience a complete electrical failure, leading to a significant loss of functionality on the flight deck, including critical instruments, communication systems, and control surfaces, such as flaps and slats, for example, ultimately requiring an immediate descent to the nearest suitable airport to land with minimal electrical power provided by emergency battery backup. However, the pilots would still have some basic manual controls to maintain control of the aircraft and attempt a safe landing. But as far as the flight recorders are concerned, we know there's no battery backup and the 737 doesn't have a RAM or a ram air turbine. You know, that little propeller generator that pops out on the bottom of other aircraft, because Boeing relied on battery backup for their critical backup systems and not a RAM. Genius, right? However, with no electrical power, most flight instruments, navigation systems, communication radios, and even the autopilot would become inoperable, making the flight management extremely challenging. While the pilots would lose most automated systems, they would still have basic manual controls to steer the aircraft, using the yoke and rudder pedals, allowing them to maintain some control and attempt a gliding descent. The aircraft would rely on the emergency battery backup to provide limited power for essential functions like basic lighting and some critical instruments for a short period. However, due to the lack of critical systems, the pilots would need to prioritize a rapid descent to the nearest suitable airport to land as soon as possible. Sound familiar? Landing with minimal electrical power would require significant skill and coordination from the pilots, as they would need to rely on visual cues and manual controls to align the aircraft with the runway. Sounds very familiar. So all of that I just mentioned from Boeing sure seems to mirror what we all witnessed with the JeJuAir. But Maximus, you say, we didn't see any damage to the cowling that would explain an explosive event and total destruction of the number 2 engine. What kind of mushrooms are you eating out there in California? And yes, I agree, that's true. But that doesn't mean a destructive event didn't occur. And I'll show you examples of past events in a minute. But back to that 2019 West Atlantic Airlines situation I was telling you about. The aircraft had departed Leipzig for Amsterdam with an inoperative left engine-driven generator, an acceptable defect. This meant the auxiliary power unit was instead used to drive the number 1 electrical system while the right engine-driven generator powered by the number 2 system. But when the aircraft arrived in Amsterdam, the first officer's instruments, which used the number 2 electrical system, intermittently blanked and blacked out the screen. However, the crew could not determine the reason, but believed the right generator had failed. Then maintenance personnel reset a circuit breaker, and after a successful right-hand engine run, the generator and the number 2 engine electrical system were considered to be functioning correctly. The aircraft then departed Amsterdam for East Midlands, but just 60 nautical miles from the destination. The first officer's flight instruments failed and went black, and the captain took manual control. Suddenly, numerous lights on both the overhead panel and annunciation panels illuminated and flashed, and multiple oral warnings were generated by the terrain avoidance system with other audible warnings sounding. Although the aircraft controls, flaps, and landing gear functioned normally, the crew had to cope with distracting visual and oral warnings throughout the approach. But then as the aircraft landed, several systems, including the auto brakes, half the exterior lights, and the captain's speed indications all failed. No electrical power was available to the cargo door, cargo bay, and multiple items on the flight deck. Examination of the aircraft at East Midlands found that the right-hand engine generator control unit had been incorrectly racked, allowing it to move forward. It was found to be protruding from the equipment shelf by just 3 centimeters, but this was sufficient for the contacts at the rear of the unit to disconnect from those on the shelf, a situation which would have resulted in the loss of several AC and DC electrical buses. Nobody was injured in that incident because they had the APU available and used it as backup. Now in this particular example, the problem was inside the plane at the GCU, which is the computer that controls the generator for the engine. However, that's what made me wonder, what if instead the problem with JeJuAir wasn't on the computer inside the plane, but at the actual generator unit on the engine itself? So then that got me thinking more. I know, dangerous, right? So to add another layer to that, what if it wasn't the actual generator unit that was damaged, but the coolant tubes that run from the generator to the cooler and back to the generator, or even the power cables themselves? What if, as soon as the bird strike happened, striking the engine like a missile with over 30 tons of force, that after the working engine shot flames and debris out of its exhaust during the compressor stall, it began losing all of its cooling oil? Or if the generator unit itself or the electric cables that deliver power to the entire aircraft were damaged? It wouldn't take long for the generator to completely shut down, leaving the plane, the cockpit, and more importantly, the data recorders with no power. So at that now famous 4-minute mark, was it the integrated drive generator or its cooling systems that were severely damaged by the 30+ ton impact of the bird strike, sending shards of fan blades and other debris into the generator or its cooling pipes, or the actual power cables that you can see here that connect to the generator just behind the turbine blades, leading to the total electrical failure? Yes, I know, this is just my own theory, but follow me here. As you can see, the unit is located here right behind the turbine titanium blades, almost completely circling the entire engine. Okay, but what about the tough cowling inlet around the engine? Well, it's been breached before in the past, and quite a few times actually, especially on older CFM models. And while the odds of my scenario happening might be considered by some to be small, you have to admit the odds of everything that took place on that JeJu crash that day were 1 in a million type odds to begin with. And severing of the power cables and damaging the generator or its cooling system could explain the total loss of power generated from the only remaining functioning engine, especially with no APU and no battery backup. And here is the picture that kicked off this whole journey for me. Look at the engine for a minute and what do you see? Sunday, June 6, 2010, a Royal Air Maroc Boeing 737-400 with 156 passengers and 6 crew was departing Schiphol Airport when the airplane collided with a flock of birds on departure, when one engine and the fuselage received substantial damage. The captain of the flight reported seeing large birds, most likely geese. The airplane landed safely 17 minutes after takeoff. The flight data recorders were removed from the aircraft and were found in good condition. It was later revealed that the aircraft received multiple large bird strikes from the same sized giant geese that occurred with the Miracle on the Hudson incident, causing substantial damage to the aircraft and the loss of its left-hand engine. Okay, so now look at this picture again. Along with a large dent at the left engine inlet, look down low on the left there. The whole inlet was breached by the blade and other debris. But look at that hole. What do you see? You can see clear through to the engine. You see a wiring harness there. I don't know if that's the integrated drive generator system or not, but I know it's open, and I know it's available to be damaged, and I know that's just where the main power source of that engine is, in the case of our plane, the JeJu 737. So that got me thinking, what if? What if during this 1 in a million action movie style crash landing that ultimately snuffed out 179 lives, thanks to that stupid South Korean runway bunker wall? What if the last remaining generator, the only generator, because the crew probably shut down the actual working engine that would have avoided the entire situation, But what if that could explain the unexplainable? However, with that said, there are literally 1,000 other explanations for what happened, and my scenario is just one man's opinion, and probably a result of having too much time on my hands and access to Google. But hey, like I said, none of the experts have found an answer and probably never will. So I figured at least it's a place to start, right? But without the voice and data recorders, we'll probably never know for sure. And with that, now let the conversation begin. It's your turn to let me know down below. Does my theory seem plausible? Or is it just crazy talk? Or is it possible? But like I said, so many of you real pros out there teach me things every day in the comment section, so get to work and let's talk about it and let me know down below. And with that hand grenade I just tossed into the room, well, now it's your turn. As always, thanks for joining me, and on your way out, don't forget to do all that YouTubey stuff. And until next time, as always, this is Maximus.